Many victims of narcissistic abuse claim to suffer PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, owing to the exposure to the abuser's maltreatment, torture, and worse. Unfortunately, this claim is counterfactual. You cannot suffer PTSD, you cannot be afflicted with PTSD in an abusive relationship. You can, however, on rare occasions, develop CPTSD, complex trauma. In 1992, Judith Herman was the first to propose this diagnosis of complex trauma, CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and that very same year, I applied it to the study of narcissistic abuse. In the following years, I gave numerous interviews and wrote many articles on how CPTSD could be an outcome of abusive relationships with narcissists and with psychopaths. And now, of course, it is a mainstream view. However, a few caveats. Very few people react with CPTSD. Very few. It's a trauma. It's not candy, you know. Not everyone develops trauma. Trauma is a highly idiosyncratic, highly specific, and rare, actually, reaction. So yes, when you're in a relationship, or so-called relationship, with a narcissist and a psychopath, chances are that you might develop CPTSD, especially if the exposure is very long and the abuse is very intense. Your chances to develop PTSD are nil, zero. And today I want to disambiguate. I want to tell you a bit about post-traumatic stress disorder. My name is Sam Vaknin, and I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, the first book ever on narcissistic abuse, and the first book that suggested that CPTSD, complex trauma, might be a useful adjunct, a useful diagnosis in the study of narcissistic abuse. I'm also a professor of psychology. So let's delve right in. Post-traumatic stress disorder. We are talking about survivors of traumatic events or highly traumatic experiences. So we're talking about people who have endured natural disasters, were the victims of crime, especially violent crime, were caught in a war or a battle zone or a conflict area, and people who have witnessed or have been victims in mass shootings. These are the kinds of events, these are the kind of occurrences that yield and produce post-traumatic stress disorder. So people in Gaza may develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Vietnam veterans who fought in Vietnam have developed post-traumatic stress disorder. People who were in Hurricane Katrina developed PTSD. And of course, mass shootings from Columbine to Norway, in all these cases, people have been diagnosed with PTSD. You cannot develop PTSD in an abuse that is low intensity, relatively speaking, when compared to war or to violent, life-threatening crime or to natural disasters. The worst abuser, narcissist or psychopath, is, with all due respect, not comparable. So when you're exposed to long-term, repetitive, low-intensity abuse, even if it is extreme, you are very unlikely to develop PTSD. Probably in some cases, you may develop CPTSD. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, involves sleep disturbances, startle reactions, jumpiness, and they last for a few months. Contrary to myths propagated online by self-styled experts, the overwhelming vast majority of people who develop PTSD symptoms recover, many of them spontaneously, after a few months, actually. Now, startle reactions are common in PTSD and very uncommon in CPTSD. Sleep disturbances, however, are common in all post-traumatic conditions, CPTSD and PTSD alike, and other types of post-traumatic conditions. There's a whole chapter in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual dedicated to traumatic disorders or disorders induced by trauma. PTSD also usually involves paranoid ideation and extreme hypervigilance, bordering on actual paranoia. So this is also an element that is usually absent in CPTSD. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual lists, how else, 8 criteria, the famous bullet list of the DSM, 8 criteria to diagnose PTSD. It requires exposure to actual or threatened death, life-threatening, serious injury, or extreme sexual violation, rape. Direct experience is one way of ending up with PTSD, but witnessing is another. Even if you have not been the victim of any of these, but you have witnessed another person being victimized, your empathy will cause you to develop PTSD. Even when you have just learned that this has happened to a loved one, this would cause you PTSD. Even if you were recurrently exposed all the time and again, repetitively exposed to details of such an event, you might develop PTSD. PTSD doesn't have to be the outcome of direct experience. It could be the outcome of vicarious experience or experience by proxy. Indeed, there is something called vicarious traumatization, which, believe it or not, afflicts mostly therapists. Now, PTSD involves flashbacks. Flashbacks are vividness. Flashbacks is when you lose your ability to tell apart memory from reality. The memory becomes real. If you were a Vietnam veteran, you're a soldier in Vietnam, you're in a supermarket, there's a sudden noise, and you're again in Vietnam. You're not in the supermarket. Supermarket vanishes, dissipates, disappears, and you are again in the killing fields of Vietnam, shooting at a helicopter, a chopper above your head. So flashbacks are about divorce, sudden, abrupt divorce from reality. It's a dissociative artifact, a dissociative syndrome, or a symptom, I'm sorry, and syndrome actually, and you lose it and you are back entrapped in the memory. The memory acquires the vividness and reality of the actual experience. You're going through it again. You're replaying and reenacting it, but you are not aware that it's a replay or reenactment. You think you are there. That's why emotional flashbacks there's no such thing. Emotional flashbacks are memories which are connected to extremely intense, overpowering, overwhelming emotions, but they are not flashbacks. So there's no such thing as emotional flashbacks. It's another piece of online nonsense based on work by people who should have known better. So flashbacks are an element in PTSD. There's an avoidance of internal and external stimuli known as triggers. Now, triggers don't have to be external. I mentioned a noise in a supermarket, a visual thing, but a smell, by the way, olfactory. But triggers can be internal. For example, the vividness of a memory, which then leads to a flashback. So it doesn't have to be external, it could be internal. And that is why nowadays we do not debrief people after life-threatening severe trauma. We don't force them to revisit the memories because this could trigger them and they could have an instance of flashback or even psychosis. PTSD involves negative alterations in cognitions and moods associated with the event. For example, feeling guilty for having survived, survivor guilt, feeling that you are to blame, you're responsible for what has happened, estrangement from your own body and sometimes from your own mind, which is a great definition of psychosis, anhedonia, inability to experience pleasure in anything, constriction, your life suddenly narrows down and you want to limit everything, your movements, your social contacts, your activities, the food you intake, everything becomes more and more and more narrow, like a tunnel. That's constriction. And of course, the aforementioned dissociation. You develop memory gaps. You tend to forget things repeatedly, including very important things, obligations, assignments, tasks, um, facts, and faces and names. And so dissociation takes over, basically metastasizes and consumes the whole of the personality and the psychodynamics. And then there are alterations in arousal and reactivity. People with PTSD become aggressive, reckless, or self-destructive. These behaviors multiply until they become normative, the norm. In other words, PTSD has a massive impact on day-to-day functioning in social settings, in the workplace, in romantic relationships, intimate relationships, in the family, in church, everywhere. It is an all-pervasive thing. It affects everything. Whereas complex trauma is more insidious, more pernicious, more slow and glacial. Complex trauma erodes you and corrodes you. PTSD explodes you, destroys you. Complex trauma is a form of implosion, whereas PTSD is a form of explosion. And the speed, the alacrity of PTSD, and the intensity and the abruptness are not, absolutely not clinical features of complex trauma. Complex trauma crawls, sprawls. Complex trauma is kind of a colonizer that captures additional territory all the time in a process that lasts, many years. Whereas PTSD just comes abruptly, takes over, destroys everything. It's like a hurricane, basically. Culture influences the symptoms of PTSD. In some cultures, somatic symptoms are more acceptable and mental symptoms are frowned upon or stigmatized, whereas in other cultures, of course, the symptoms are mostly psychological. There's a high prevalence of comorbidities. PTSD often comes with depression and substance use disorder, SUD, substance abuse. This is also common in complex trauma. Complex trauma, we have depression, anxiety, substance abuse. They are common comorbidities or co-occurrences with CPTSD. But as I said, one of the main differentiating factors in the differential diagnosis between PTSD and CPTSD are the flashbacks. You're being taken over by a memory that seems utterly real to you, intrusive memories. And this also happens in dreams. The dreams become so real that when you wake up, you can't tell the difference. And the dream continues actually in reality. This causes a lot of alarm and distress. And ultimately, someone with PTSD develops avoidant behaviors, a defensive withdrawal from distressing memories, thoughts, feelings, as well as external and internal reminders, triggers. But so much can trigger you, a triggering cascade. You can be triggered by so many things that ultimately you avoid everything. Close yourself in a dark room, and that's it. Don't even open the television. PTSD is discriminating. It's higher among the young, among women, minorities, and people with comorbidities, pre-existing conditions. In other words, people who are already weakened somehow. They're weak. They have shortcomings, vulnerabilities, frailties. They're more likely to develop PTSD. People with poor psychosocial resources, for example, people in developing countries display more PTSD than people in developed countries, industrial countries. So when you're weak, when you're down, when you're vulnerable, you're more likely to develop PTSD. And there's something known as threshold PTSD. It's not clinically, there's a big debate whether it exists or not, so it's not yet clinically recognized. Threshold PTSD actually characterizes anywhere between 50 to 90% of people who have been exposed to trauma-inducing events, natural disasters, violent crime, rape, and so on. So it seems that everyone reacts with something, a condition that could develop into full-fledged PTSD, but doesn't. Whereas threshold PTSD characterizes 50 to 90% of people. PTSD is anywhere between 10 to 30%, depending on the settings, the culture, the intensity of the event, the extent of the threat to life or personal injury, and so on. The rates are much reduced when there is a cohesive community response, a social network that affords succor and understanding and acceptance and empathy, and so on. People who surround the person with PTSD can mitigate and ameliorate the PTSD. And PTSD is more common in man-made traumatic events than in natural disasters, because I think there's a perception of evil at work. It's like coming face to face with evil. So terrorism, mass shootings, war, rape, they provoke the onset of PTSD much more commonly than natural disasters. And still, in COVID-19, in the pandemic, for example, we saw sharply elevated stress and trauma-related disorders, including, on some occasions, rare occasions, PTSD. I think it's because COVID-19 was perceived as man-made, actually, not as a natural disaster. We have quite a few tools to deal with PTSD. We have talk therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, brief eclectic therapy, narrative exposure therapy, written narrative exposure, and even virtual reality. And lately, AI is entering the game. So we have quite a few tools, and they are superior to psychopharmacology. SSRIs somehow are helpful, especially in the initial stages, but antipsychotics are not. They're counterindicated as a first-line treatment. Debriefing is definitely nowadays a no-no. You should not do that, although we have been doing it for decades. Okay, acute stress disorder is one of the precursors of PTSD. So there are conditions that lead to PTSD if they are left untackled and untreated. An acute stress disorder required what is known as PIES: proximity, immediacy, expectancy, and simplicity. There's a protocol of treatment that requires the presence of supportive people, including professionals, immediate reactions, developing specific expectations regarding the treatment, and keeping it simple. This usually somehow puts acute stress disorder, ASD, under control and prevents it from developing into full-fledged PTSD. You can already see that PTSD has very little to do with complex trauma or CPTSD. So next time you're the victim of narcissistic abuse, don't go spewing nonsense about how this gave you PTSD. It did not.